Treasury's proposal for a total debt relief arrangement for Eskom, new tax measures and increases in social grants are just some of the major take-homes from Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana's budget yesterday. But concerns are now being raised about where government should be spending its money. Let's unpack this for you now. Bring in Angelo Fick, who's with the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, and Casac's Lawson Naidoo. Both our guests joining us via our video link this morning. It's great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for making time to speak to us. Of course, 24 hours, an incredibly long time in South Africa. Yesterday, it's very plausible that you would have gone to sleep thinking that we've got a CEO at Eskom, only to wake up this morning finding out that that's changed drastically. Angelo, let me get your take first of all, especially around this issue of disclosure. The statement itself, as I've been saying the whole morning, is only 3 sentences long, and that opens the door for a lot of conjecture in a context where we know this has been an incredibly, in some instances, politicized issue that's very controversial. Has it been well handled, this exit?
I don't think the exit was well handled at all, not since it was announced last year, when questions were raised about the timeline of the exit and the so-called handover period, in which, questions of poisoning got raised. And throughout this, there have always been concerns about the role that the minister plays in these decision-making processes, given his and the party, the ANC's commitment to a certain trajectory for energy supply in South Africa. And that may not necessarily have gelled with various people and observers in South Africa in the energy sector. So one does wonder what caused this particular last-minute panic that led for the early exit rather than the projected one. And that, of course, also can't help people's perspectives on stability at Eskom if we have these changes in plans from month to month, and now it seems from day to day.
Absolutely. And, of course, Lawson, what doesn't help is that Andre de Ruyter had quite the interview just days earlier where he made all kinds of allegations around how the ANC, or at least some members of the party, still want to benefit illegally from contracts at Eskom.
Indeed, and those revelations were extremely concerning. And they mirror and echo much of the testimony that was heard by Chief Justice Zondo during the State Capture Commission. So it really signals that not a lot has changed in terms of the modus operandi of those complicit in large-scale fraud and corruption and state capture. And that is something that I think really dominated yesterday's budget, because the after effects of state capture are very much still with us, and this budget has had to deal with a lot of those issues and aspects of what has been happening.
It takes us back to the question around whether or not it still makes sense to throw money at Eskom, given what we know has taken place, and suggestions now of what is still continuing potentially, Angelo. This 254 billion rand that's going to be made available for part of Eskom's debt, because we know that debt is in excess now of 400 billion rand. The optics around that, does it still make sense?
Well, I'm not sure if it does or doesn't make sense, but for people who keep telling us that we, are not in an austerity budget, that we're a pro-poor, developmental state, all of these rhetoric moments, really become problematic when you're suggesting that this amount of money, which is almost double the education budget for, basic education in some senses, and also, massively inflated on higher education, and actually multiple times what we're supposed to give on vocational education, in a space that is so riven with corruption, problems, accusations of sabotage, and at the same time, we're suggesting there's going to be a green transition, that the products we're going to generate in Eskom will remain a, largely coal-powered entity. One does wonder what the longer-term vision is in this government, because these Band-Aid plasters haven't resolved issues at Eskom in 30 years. We've flung, since the turn of the millennium, more than 30 billion at these people for bailouts, probably much more. Now there's going to be a debt guarantee of 254 billion, and still we have no guarantee that we'll have energy, that we'll have power. And a year ago, the president made all sorts of remarks about 18,000 megawatts being made available. They haven't been made available. So what is it about these promises, this money being flung? And if Andre de Ruyter's accusations about contracts and beneficiation via channels that aren't the legitimate ones at Eskom are true, one wonders how much of this is going to end up possibly dealing with ANC concerns about re-election in 2024 and how those monies will be spent.
Yeah, Lawson, the president spent a considerable amount of time speaking about social compacts in his sonas gone by, kind of touched on it in the sona this year as well. And then you juxtapose that to the questions being raised in the public domain about whether or not we can trust the government and, by extension, the finance minister, that they are working to our best interest when it comes to how they're spending all of this money.
Indeed, I mean that's an issue and a dilemma for the finance minister each time the budget is presented. It's always a balancing act, and I think the numbers that come through from yesterday's budget, economic growth forecasts have been leveraged downwards now. So we're not going to be growing this economy. We're not going to be generating more income. We're living on the back of an increase in tax from the previous financial year, which has enabled the Minister of Finance not to increase personal and other taxes at the moment. And we've got to look at this budget also in the context that, it's a precursor to an election next year. Mm. So government is not going to do anything to tamper, for example, with the social wage, with social welfare benefits, the continuation of the social relief of distress grants, even though that has not been increased to keep line with inflation. So these are some of the difficult choices that the Minister of Finance had to make yesterday. And, whilst there has been an increase in funding for, education and health and the policing sectors, it's a question of whether those resources are being adequately targeted and spent. For example, adding 15,000 police trainees over the next 3 years is not going to make any significant dent in fighting crime if the police stations, police vehicles, and other resources to combat crime are not there. If adequate training of police officers is not conducted. So, it's a question of whether the funding that's being made available is being targeted in the right areas.
Yeah. Speaking about targeting things in the right areas, Angelo, I mean, there's always this debate about what constitutes a pro-poor budget. You've already alluded to the fact that you doubt this one was, despite the fact that social grants have been increased, although people like Lawson will tell you that not enough.
Absolutely. If you're adding 30 rand per month to a child's upkeep, you're clearly not living in the reality of what it costs to keep even a poor child alive. 30 rand is not a significant amount of money, and that 30 rand assumes that the child lives in a household, and we know what the unemployment rate is, where there are people generating other forms of income. And so the pro-poor budget problem for me is that it also isn't a particularly specifically gendered budget. So the work of people like Debbie Budlander for the last 30 years on how you can create budgets that actually benefit those people that will pass the beneficiation on, that hasn't been properly thought through. And my concern is that there is some truth to the critiques being leveled by trade unions about, the kind of larger framework within which this is happening. That to some extent, the people that govern South Africa they've decided, quite frankly, that as a class, they will govern South Africa in the way that Samir Amin suggested those who govern marginal peripheries in the world system will govern the system. That they will do so to the benefit of external investors, whether those are considered multinationals or whether they're considered to be tourists from elsewhere in the world, and not necessarily to the beneficiation of the ordinary people on whom they depend for their re-election. And so one has to have concerns about how that social compact in a constitutional democracy will be built if more and more people are left out, more and more people are rendered surplus, because they're not part of this vision that is deeply neoliberal, deeply pro large conglomerates of business, and don't really, at some very fundamental level, build a foundational, principled developmental state.
Yeah, I mean, speaking about our principles, Lawson, many people look to civil society organizations to help keep government in check and to help them, I suppose, keep true to those principles in one way or the other. Not much we heard, though, about civil society organizations in yesterday's budget, unless I missed it. I wonder what message you reckon in that sense.
Well, there wasn't, and I think, that's indicative of the fact that, the non-profit sector is largely ignored by the state and left to get on with its, with its work on its own. And I think without the non-profit sector, the broad civil society sector, South Africa would be a much poorer in a much poorer state in all respects. One doesn't expect, because we've come accustomed to not expecting any support or assistance from the state in some of the critical work that is being done, particularly by social welfare organizations who really, complement and actually, in many cases, do the job that government ought to be doing. But I think this is, again, government showing its reliance on the sector whilst ignoring it at the same time, because it is doing the job that government itself feels it doesn't need to allocate resources to those spaces because others are doing it for them. But it's something that is unsustainable, and it's going to come into a head at some point. So as Angelo rightly points out, if we're talking about a pro-poor budget, we need to see targeted interventions that can actually make a difference to the issues of, as the government keeps telling us, poverty, inequality, and unemployment.
Plenty to think about, especially when you consider what's taken place in the last 24 hours, not only at City Hall in Cape Town, but also at Eskom in Megawatt Park. Angelo, Fick, and Lawson, Naidoo, thanks very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate your weighing in on this Thursday.